Welcome or welcome back to Domain 4 of the Comptia Security Plus Exam Cram series. Today we are focused on operations and incident response. And as usual, we're going to touch on every topic in Domain 4 as detailed in the official exam syllabus to ensure you're ready to drill down to the right answer on exam day. And as always, this series is designed to be comprehensive but targeted coverage that helps you get further faster in mastering this material before the big day. I'm glad you're here. We have lots to cover, so let's get started. Welcome to Domain 4 of this Comptia Security Plus Exam Cram series. Domain 4 focuses on operations and incident response, and it's one of the lighter domains both in terms of its weighting and the size of the content. So this video will be a bit shorter than domains 1 through 3 on the whole. Again, we have 6 core videos in this series. One intro that lays out the strategy I recommend for preparing for the Security Plus exam, and then one video per domain. I'll release some shorter supplemental lessons as your questions guide me toward the topics you find most challenging. And in covering the content in the exam, I'm really putting a lot of weight behind what shows up in the official exam objectives. So everything we talk about in this video will go line by line through all the topics in the Security Plus exam objectives for Domain 4. And to fully prepare yourself quickly, I recommend the official Security Plus exam study guide and practice test bundle from Cybex, which includes 1,000 flashcards, 1,000 practice questions, and 2 practice exams, which you can access online. And you'll find the least expensive option out on Amazon.com in the video description. Now, this bundle also comes with a 10% exam discount coupon, which then knocks off most of the cost of the bundle itself. So a great bargain in that sense. And as with all of my exam cram videos, you'll find a PDF copy of this presentation available in the video description. And in 4.1, given a scenario, use the appropriate tool to assess organizational security. So you may see questions on any one of about 36 different tools ranging from network reconnaissance and discovery to file manipulation, to shell, to packet capture, to forensics. I will say that hands-on learning will be helpful in this. I am going to try to give you a head start in that respect, both in providing not only function, but syntax and some guidance on how you can test these tools hands-on quickly and easily in Windows and Linux, even if you don't have a Linux workstation. And just a friendly warning before we get started, do not use active reconnaissance tools to explore or exploit resources without permission. There can definitely be legal consequences for you. Keep this in the lab. Okay, let's start with the network reconnaissance and discovery category. So there's traceroute, which shows the route taken from a computer to a remote host, like a website. And what's interesting about traceroute is it also shows you response latency in milliseconds at each hop. Now, NSLookup is a diagnostic tool for verifying the IP address of a host name, what we'd call a DNS-A record by default in the DNS server database. And we can use the setType command to change the type of record it searches. For example, if I would execute setType equals MX, that would change the scope to search mail exchange records, so email servers. So let's just switch to a command prompt and we'll take a quick look. So if I type NSLookup MSN.com, for example, as a short domain, it returns the host name for MSN.com. And if I go into interactive mode, I'll just type NSLookup and hit enter. I'm now at an NSLookup active mode prompt, and I'll set type to MX. And now I'm looking at mail exchange records, and if I type MSN.com, you see it returns a different type of record. Now, this is passive. You can use NSLookup for active functions like zone transfer, and as again I mentioned earlier, proceed with caution. Do not perform active reconnaissance on resources that are not yours. And dig is the equivalent of NSLookup in a Linux or Unix environment. We have the IP and IF config tools. These commands show IP configuration on the host you're running. So Windows uses ipconfig, Unix or Linux, the command is ifconfig, but they're showing similar information. Nmap, a very prolifically used free and open source network mapper that can be used to create an inventory of devices on your network. It's also very useful for what we call banner grabbing, which is computer and service information. And very much an active reconnaissance tool, so proceed with caution. Next up, we have pathping, which has the functionality of both ping and traceroute. So with ping, we get an ICMP echo, and with traceroute, we get the hops to a destination host. So with pathping, we get both of those things, and it also calculates statistics after the trace, showing us the packet loss at each hop along the way that it passes through. We have hping, which is an open source packet generator and analyzer for the TCP/IP protocol, which is often used for auditing firewalls and networks. For example, testing firewall rules and open ports. It analyzes network traffic, including your packet formats and traceroute. So in the world of forensics, you'll hear about netstat frequently, which is a native tool on the Windows operating system. And this is used to see the established connections, listening ports, and even running services on a host. You'll hear about netstat as an option for capturing volatile information, because that information, the listening ports and the established connections, will disappear once we reboot that computer. And really all you have to do at a command prompt is type netstat-a, for example, and you're going to see listening ports and established connections. Moving on, we then have netcat, or NC, which is a Linux or Unix utility for showing network connections, port scanning, and you can even use it for file transfer. IP scanners are very common, so scanning ranges of IPs. The Angry IP scanner has been around for a long time, probably 15-20 years or better. It's a popular free and open source tool that will scan addresses in a range, and it will ID open ports on those hosts. And you can export the results to a text, CSV, or XML format. And comes in a command line version as well, but the GUI version I see used very frequently. The Address Resolution Protocol, or ARP, is a protocol for mapping an IP address to a physical MAC address on a network adapter, for example. We call that the hardware address. And ARP-A at the command line will show the ARP cache. You can also use that ARP command line utility to flush the ARP cache if you typed ARP-D, for example. Route enables listing existing routes in the local routing table, as well as adding manual entries into your network routing tables on a host. Route print shows you the route table. Route add would add a route. Route delete would delete a route. Curl is a command line tool used to transfer data using any number of supported protocols. So quite a list ranging from FTP to IMAP to TFTP to Telnet. Pretty commonly used with HTTP, in my experience, to grab information about websites. We have the Harvester, which is a passive tool that comes with Kali Linux, the Linux distribution used by penetration testers, generally speaking. The Harvester will harvest email addresses of an organization. So for example, I could search for email addresses in the kali.org domain, limiting results to 500 and using Google as my source. And as you can see, with a very short command, then I can pull back quite a lot of information that could then be leveraged in offensive exercises, such as a phishing campaign. On a side note, if you don't have Linux installed anywhere today, you can actually run Linux on Windows 10 or 11 using the Windows subsystem for Linux, which will give you essentially a Linux kernel there. You'll have a command prompt where you can run some of these tools that we're looking at today. And the Windows subsystem for Linux includes a Kali Linux distribution, and you can set this up in just a few minutes. I absolutely recommend it so you can safely test these tools in your lab. So next up we have Sniper, which is a penetration test reconnaissance tool that can be used for automated testing. It can scan for vulnerabilities, open ports, web application vulnerabilities, we'd call that dynamic code analysis, and perform attack surface discovery. It's frequently used by pen testers, bug bounty researchers, and even red teams. But it's really kind of an all-in-one offensive security tool that has a free version, but also a very powerful and fairly expensive paid version. Scanless is a penetration testing tool for performing anonymous open port scans on target hosts like web servers, and this is free and open source. It's actually written in Python, and it utilizes a number of existing port scanners out there like IP fingerprints and Spider IP. So you'd see this commonly on Linux. Then we have DNS-enum, which is a command line tool that automatically identifies basic DNS records, and it has the ability to attempt reverse DNS resolution. That's where you start with an IP address and try to map it to a name, as opposed to forward DNS resolution, where we provide a name and receive an IP address. DNS-enum will brute force. It will query for the existence of host names in order to get their IP addresses as subdomains and host names. It's often used in web penetration testing to identify potential targets for further exploration. You'll find this on Kali Linux out of the box. It's actually a Perl script that enumerates DNS information in various respects. Nessus is a network security vulnerability scanner. It utilizes plugins, which are separate files, to handle the vulnerability checks themselves, and it raises an alert if it discovers any vulnerabilities that malicious hackers could use to gain access. You'll find Nessus resources for both Linux and Windows. And then finally we have Cuckoo, which is a tool that creates a sandbox that can be used for analyzing files for malware inspection. So moving on to the file manipulation category, this really describes tools that we use when we want to look deeper into different files, examining log files, for example. So here are a few tools that fall into the file manipulation category. We'll start with concatenate, which is the cat command in Linux. We can use this to create files, view files, and also to concatenate several files into another single file. So to create a new file called weblog, I'd simply use this syntax. So cat and what we'd call the greater than symbol and the word weblog, and that creates the file. Now I could also concatenate the content of 3 of my log files and put them into a single log file like this. So I'm essentially using the cat command, listing all of those files I'd like to concatenate, the pipe symbol, and then sorting into sample file.txt. That's where I see the cat command used pretty frequently. And then we have the head command. So the var log messages file is a pretty important log file on a Linux system because it shows some system events like shutdown and reboot. So I could use the head command to check the top 10 messages from that log. So I'm looking at the head of the log. So for example, to get the top 10, I'm simply using head, passing the name of the log, and then the end parameter with the number of events I'd like to return. And to be clear, I believe understanding the function of these tools will be more important than understanding the command syntax, but I wanted to give you some examples. Number one, because it helps kind of lock the concept of these tools into your mind in terms of their function, but it also gives you an example. So if you'd like to go do a little hands-on on your own, you'll have some starters. Now the opposite of the head command is the tail command. So tail shows us the last X lines at the end of a log file, and the syntax would be very similar to head. So for example, if I wanted to look at the last 10 messages in that same var log messages file, I can just swap the head command for tail, and I'm going to see the last 10 messages. So one looks at the beginning of a file, the other looks at the end. Now grep is a very commonly used search tool for searching text and log files for specific values. So for example, if I wanted to search a file named users.txt for the name Pete, here's my syntax. I can also use grep to search directories. So if I wanted to search a whole directory for the word project, the syntax is a bit simpler yet. Of course, this assumes I am in that directory. Change mod. So this command is used to change the permission level on a file or directory. We've talked about Linux permissions previously. So for example, change mod 766, that would give the owner read, write, execute, would give the group read, write, and others, which would be users who are not the owner, would have read, write. So Linux permissions are covered briefly in domain 3. So if this command doesn't make sense to you, go back and look at how Linux permissions work, and I think that will help. Logger can add messages to a local system log file or to a remote syslog server. And it's very commonly used to send log messages from automation scripts, which I use it for all the time. So we can record actions that are performed or errors that we encounter in the context of a script even in non-security scenarios, although in security scenarios it helps us maintain that audit trail or to help with logging based on findings. So for example, if you wanted to log a message on a remote syslog server at address 10.10.10.10, here's your syntax, and you can supply the text message that you would like to be logged with that event. But what you'll find about the tools in this category, they're everyday commands present on just about any flavor of Linux, and if you were to work as a Linux admin for any length of time, I expect you would use some of them quite frequently. So let's move on to the shell and script environments category, and we'll start with SSH, which was created to serve as a secure alternative to Telnet for running commands remotely. It's commonly used when you want secure access, remote access to network devices, and it can be used as a command line tool or a GUI tool. I tend to see it used in the command line context most often. It's not browser based, but unlike Telnet, SSH traffic is encrypted. That's the reason for secure alternative. Now, PowerShell is a very popular scripting language used to perform tasks in a Windows environment. Although it has been ported to Linux, it's really Windows environments where we see it used, and each command is known as a commandlet. They can be saved into scripts with a .ps1 extension, and each PowerShell commandlet is comprised of a noun and a verb. So for example, get-help will show the help commands. Python is a very powerful programming language and a very popular programming language, many years listed as the single most popular language in the world, and used by open source developers and data scientists, and it's very widely used in the world of cybersecurity. OpenSSL, it's a suite that can be used to create and manage TLS and SSL protocol functions. You'll very commonly see this used to generate private keys, to create certificate requests, to install your SSL or TLS certificates, and to identify certificate information. One of the most common uses I see for OpenSSL is creating a self-signed certificate that you can use in your lab environment. And the exam objectives calls out a couple of tools in the packet capture and replay category. So a protocol analyzer is sometimes called a packet sniffer, and it saves output that it sniffs off the network into a file, usually with a .pcap extension, a packet capture file, which is a standard format that's well defined and pretty broadly supported. So for example, TCP replay is an open source tool that can be used to analyze PCAP files generated by Wireshark or TCP dump, and it can then replay the traffic and send it to a network intrusion prevention system if you like. Now, TCP dump is a network packet analyzer command line tool on Linux and Unix. For example, I can basically run a very simple TCP dump command and specify which Ethernet interface I'd like it to work on, and it's going to show me information from that adapter. And Wireshark is a free and open source packet analyzer, really the one I see most commonly in the field today. And it includes command line and GUI versions. It's available for Windows and Linux, and it supports that packet capture, PCAP file format. So the forensics category includes tools often used in forensic investigation. So for example, we have the DD tool. So when the forensics team needs to investigate an image on a desktop or a laptop, we can use the DD command to clone a disk or copy a folder in a Linux or Unix environment. So in a Linux or Unix environment, in a SCSI scenario, the first disk would be dev/SDA, the second would be dev/SDB, and if we had multiple partitions on a disk, the first would be SD1, the second SD2, for example. The if command is the input file, and the of command represents the output file when we're working with the DD tool. So if I wanted to copy an entire hard disk, if I was going to copy, say, the first SCSI disk to the second SCSI disk, the syntax would look like this. Now, if I was going to create an image of the SDA disk, I would use this syntax. So just a couple of examples to get you started with the DD tool. Then we have WinHex, which is a hexadecimal editor that can be used on any version of the Windows operating system to help the forensics team find evidence. It can be used to find and recover deleted or lost data from a corrupt drive, for example. And capturing system memory dump files. So when a computer system crashes, in the Windows world we hear the blue screen of death, right? All of the content of the memory at that time is saved to a dump file. It has a DMP extension. And the dump files can be analyzed using a tool like Blue Screen Review. Linux has an equivalent called memdump, but you'll see this pretty commonly in situations where we need to explore the contents of memory at the time a system crashed, whether it was due to a security exploit or otherwise. FTK Manager is a data preview and imaging tool that lets you quickly assess electronic evidence to determine if further analysis with a forensic tool is warranted. And it is a free tool. Now, Autopsy can be used to analyze hard drives, smartphones, and media cards, so storage media essentially, and it has a built-in translator to translate foreign languages into English, incidentally. The exam objectives call out exploitation frameworks. So exploitation frameworks, like the open source Metasploit framework, contain capabilities to detect and then exploit vulnerabilities on remote systems. They're great for helping you to harden your IT systems before they're attacked. So you can use these proactively. And they use information from the National Vulnerability Database, which is comprised of common vulnerabilities and exposures. You probably recognize that CVE acronym that you'll see in the reports that come from vulnerability scanners. And it uses the common vulnerability scoring system to show the level of severity of each of these vulnerabilities. So these elements, the CVE and CVSS, you'll commonly see in vulnerability scanning scenarios. So the most popular exploit frameworks include Metasploit, Core Impact, and Immunity Canvas. And rounding out 4.1, we'll touch on password crackers, which include the Kane portion of Kane Enable or Loft Crack, which has been around since the 90s. These can be used to crack passwords and create password hashes. Now, in the Security Plus exam, when you see names in clear text followed by hashes, the hash is generally a password hash. Data sanitation. So this is the process of irreversibly removing or destroying data stored on a memory device. Hard drives, flash memory, SSDs, etc. When we think about the information lifecycle, which we'll touch on a bit later, it's important to use the proper technique to ensure that all data is purged that we expect to be purged in a manner that it's not recoverable. And 4.2, summarize the importance of policies, processes, and procedures for incident response. So we'll be touching on incident response plans and processes. We'll talk about types of incident response exercises. We'll touch on attack frameworks and a number of business continuity related topics. But first, I want to talk for just a moment about the terms plan, process, and procedure. So what exactly is the difference between these three, because they show up in the exam objectives in various contexts. So a plan is a set of intended actions, usually mutually related, through which one expects to achieve a goal. Then we have a process, which is a series of related tasks or methods that together turn inputs into outputs. And then a procedure is a prescribed way of undertaking a process or part of a process. It's a particular method for performing a task. So a plan is very high level, it's light on details. The process is an ordered task list or a flowchart, and a procedure is really task level details. It's the how something gets done. So in terms of the level of detail, plan is fairly low, procedure is fairly high. So just lock that in mind as we're talking through the exam objectives. Now we'll talk about the 6 phases of incident response as you'll see them on the Security Plus exam. These really map to the SANS Institute's definition of incident response, whereas on other exams like the CISSP exam, you might see NIST definitions of incident response factor in there. So we'll start with phase 1, preparation, which is where incident response plans are written and configurations are documented. So phase 2, identification, is determining whether or not an organization has been breached, whether we have an incident here or not. 3 is containment, so limiting damage, the scope of an incident. Eradication, so once affected systems are identified, we then initiate coordinated isolation or shutdown, rebuild, and appropriate notifications. Now, recovery is where root cause is addressed and time to return to normal operations is estimated and executed. And then finally, in phase 6, lessons learned helps prevent recurrence and improve the incident response process. So you may see questions around incident response on the exam. This is the framework you're working from. You may see questions about a couple of different types of incident response exercises. So let's start with the tabletop exercise, which is one where you distribute copies of incident response plans to the members of the incident response team for their review, and they'll provide feedback about any updates that are needed to keep those plans current. Now, this is purely a paper-based hypothetical exercise. Then we have a walkthrough, which is one where members of the incident response team gather in a large conference room and they role play an incident scenario. In that case, the exact scenario is usually only known to the test moderator, who presents the details to the team at the meeting. This can ensure that needed tools and resources are available and team members are familiar with their roles in an incident response scenario. Now, this is test team response without full simulation, so we're still just talking at this point. Now, the simulation is like the structured walkthrough, except that some of the response measures are then tested on non-critical functions. So this involves some form of doing, and that's the key differentiator of the simulation. So let's talk attack frameworks, starting with MITRE. So MITRE is an online framework that can be used by commercial organizations. It was developed by a U.S. government-sponsored company whose aim is to help prevent cyber attacks. It provides information about adversaries and their attack methods, and it uses the acronym ATTACK with the ampersand in the middle there to better articulate the attack vectors used by attackers. So that acronym stands for adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. So adversarial, this looks at the behavior of potential attackers who are put into different groups. Then tactics are the medium by which or how the attack will be carried out. Techniques are a breakdown of the processes of how an attack will be launched. And then common knowledge is documentation relating to the attacker's tactics and techniques that have been made available online to the general public. Next up is the cyber kill chain, which traces the stages of a cyber attack from early reconnaissance to the exfiltration of data. We'll work with the Lockheed Martin edition, which I think of as the original cyber kill chain. Truth be told, it was developed from a military model, but this will give us a good baseline so you understand the concept. And in phase 1, we have reconnaissance. So this is where we harvest email addresses, company information. This is really passive. This isn't actually touching the target in a detectable way. Phase 2 is weaponization. This is where the actor creates malware tailored to the vulnerabilities of the remote target. So what these two phases have in common is that neither has reached out and touched the intended victim in a measurable way yet, in a detectable fashion. Step 3 is delivery. So this is delivering the weaponized bundle to the victim via email, like a phishing attack, a malicious website, or perhaps a compromised USB drive. In the case of USB, that's where the trick of dropping a USB drive in the parking lot might be the avenue to get that weaponized bundle into the organization. Phase 4 is exploitation. So this is exploiting a vulnerability to execute code on the victim's system. Phase 5, installing malware on the asset. So this is really establishing the foundation for persistence. At which point, command and control, phase 6, a command channel for remote manipulation of the victim. At this point, the actor has a persistent capability within the organization, and they can begin at that point with hands on the keyboard to access the victim's environment and begin to accomplish their original goals, which generally speaking mean the exfiltration, the theft of sensitive and valuable information. The Diamond model of intrusion analysis is a framework for gathering intelligence on network intrusion attacks, and it's comprised of 4 key elements. First is adversary. That's the threat actor group. That's the attacker. Capabilities. This is where the adversary develops an exploit that they use to carry out the attack. Infrastructure. This is how the attacker can get to the victim, and the victim is the person targeted by the adversary. This was used in the intelligence community pretty commonly until it was declassified in 2013. The communication plan details how relevant stakeholders will be informed in the event of an incident, like a security breach. It would include a plan to maintain confidentiality, such as encrypting messages, to ensure that the event does not become public knowledge before the organization is ready. The contact list should be maintained that includes stakeholders from the government, police, customers, suppliers, and internal staff. Now, I mentioned government, which may not be applicable in all cases, but certainly regulated industries like the banking industry, the government has an agency they'll be in touch with. Compliance regulations like GDPR include notification requirements, relevant parties, and timelines that the organization must adhere to. And confidentiality amongst internal stakeholders is desirable, so external stakeholders can be informed in accordance to the plan. So let's talk stakeholder management. So when we have an incident, there are multiple groups of relevant stakeholders within the organization we need to inform and manage. And that may include internal stakeholders, our cyber insurance provider, business partners, customers, and law enforcement. So a stakeholder is really a party with an interest in an enterprise. Our corporate stakeholders could also include investors, employees, customers, and suppliers. And as I mentioned, regulated industries like banking and healthcare will have requirements driven by the regulations governing their industries, so they will generally also have some agency from within the government who is on their list of stakeholders. I want to talk through a couple of business continuity planning related definitions worth knowing just to increase your comprehension of this topic as we prepare for the exam. So the business continuity plan is the overall organizational plan for how to continue business. The disaster recovery plan is the plan for recovering from a disaster impacting IT and returning the IT infrastructure to operation, which of course supports the business. Then there's a continuity of operations plan. This is the plan for continuing to do business until the IT infrastructure can be restored. I'm not expecting you'll hear about continuity of operations plan on the exam, but it is a thing, so I wanted to mention it. But let's talk about the difference between business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning. So what exactly is the difference here? Well, business continuity planning focuses on the whole business. It focuses on getting back to doing business, where disaster recovery focuses more on the technical aspects of recovery. So BCP will cover communications and process more broadly. Another way to think of it is business continuity planning as an umbrella policy, and disaster recovery planning falls under that umbrella as part of the broader plan. So when we talked about exercises, I mentioned the incident response team a couple of times. So let's talk about the incident response team. So when we have an incident, we need a team with duties that they understand to deal with the incident. So members of this team, the roles will include an incident response manager, who's a top-level manager taking charge of response to the incident, a security analyst, which would be more technical support to the incident, an auditor who checks that the company is compliant, a risk analyst who evaluates all aspects of risk around the incident. HR will be involved sometimes because employees may be involved in the incident. If we have a malicious insider, HR could play a prominent role. And the legal department will certainly make decisions on legal issues, and they may give advice during the incident response process, such as around communication, to ensure that the language used by the organization in communicating the details of the incident don't put the company at additional and undue risk. And then public relations deals with the press to reduce the impact, the negative impact of the organization, including damage to the business's reputation. So I want to talk about the information lifecycle from a functional perspective, and this is purely to address the last item on the exam objectives for 4.2, which is retention policies. So this is purely from a functional perspective. You don't need to memorize this particular life cycle. More on that in a moment. So in the creation phase, data can be created by users, such as a user creating a file. Data can be created by systems, such as a system logging access to a file. Now, once data has been created, it's important to ensure that data is classified as soon as possible so it's appropriately handled and protected. And in the storage of data, we need to make sure that there is adequate encryption and access controls in place based on the classification of that data. And in usage, this is any time the data is in use or in transit over a network, we need to make sure that it's appropriately encrypted. Then in the archive phase, we sometimes have to archive data to comply with laws or regulations requiring the retention of data, which is why this could also be called the retention phase. A data retention policy ensures a company retains data as long as necessary. As long as necessary is defined by company policies or regulatory requirements based on the type of data we're dealing with. And when data comes to end of life, it should be destroyed, and it should be destroyed in a way that it is not readable or recoverable, because keeping data longer than necessary increases risk. Data we're keeping around longer than necessary is data that could be exfiltrated in a security breach. It's data that we could be forced to produce in a legal discovery process. Now, the information lifecycle to know for the exam is covered in Domain 5, and that's the one I want you to remember. I'm just giving you a functional walkthrough how we need to handle our information so we could speak specifically to data retention policies that are called out in the exam objectives. What you'll need to remember for the exam in terms of the information lifecycle is actually a bit simpler than what we covered here, but I wanted to give you a foundation in secure information handling throughout its lifecycle from creation through destruction, and so we could touch on data retention as called out in this exam objective. So just to recap a couple of topics we covered here briefly, data classification is the labeling or tagging of data based on its type, like personally identifiable information, protected health information, etc. We'll talk more on classifications in Domain 5. Regulatory compliance. So for legal and compliance reasons, you may need to keep certain data for different periods of time. Just to give you a couple of examples here. Financial data often needs to be retained for 7 years in the US, and some medical data may need to be retained for up to 20 or 30 years. And the data retention policy ensures that legal and compliance issues are addressed. That brings us to 4.3, where given an incident, utilize appropriate data sources to support an investigation. So we'll touch on SIM dashboards, a variety of log files. We'll talk about syslog, metadata, netflow data, just to name a few. We'll start with vulnerability scans. So a vulnerability scanner can identify and report various vulnerabilities before they are exploited. So this will give us insight into software flaws, missing patches, open ports, services that shouldn't be running at all, weak passwords, really just to name a few. This will help companies avoid known attacks like SQL injection, buffer overflows, and denial of service. We want to run those vulnerability scans on a recurring basis, like monthly is what I see commonly performed in many organizations. And if possible, we want to run a credentialed vulnerability scan, a scan with credentials so it will have greater access, making it a bit more effective in exposing potential vulnerabilities. So SIM dashboards, we've talked about security information event management, and SIM collects data from many sources into a central location for correlation and analysis, and the dashboard is going to give us centralized visibility into information on threats in real time. And SIEM solutions may ingest data from sensors deployed across your network to monitor and collect changes in network patterns or monitor changes in log file entries as events occur. It really varies by solution and device. Some vendors may use a sensor, it may be syslog for others, or an API for others still. Can help us with monitoring sensitive data, PII, PHI, ensuring we maintain regulatory compliance with whether it's HIPAA, GDPR, PCI DSS. It can help us identify trends in network traffic, event volume, or change in activities or activity levels across identities, endpoints, network, and infrastructure in our environment. And a SIEM solution can typically provide alerts with information about events on hosts and our network. And optionally, your SIEM solutions can typically provide email notification and response automation through playbooks, the SOAR function we've talked about previously. Correlation. So a SIEM solution can correlate, aggregate, and analyze the data from multiple sources to give us a broad central view across our IT silos, giving us greater context into the true impact and scope of an incident. And because the sequence of events crosses multiple sources, time sync definitely matters. You want to make sure that your systems keep their time in sync. NTP is typically the protocol we use to make that happen. Log files can play a core role in providing evidence for your investigation, so you'll want to be familiar with the different types of log files mentioned in the exam objectives for the Security Plus exam. Now, network logs come from our network devices of various types, and they can identify IP and MAC addresses of devices that are attached to your network and conversations between those devices. We usually see these logs sent to a central syslog server for storage and processing and potentially consumption by a SIEM solution. Network intrusion and prevention can be important in identifying threats and anomalies in our network traffic. Log files from a proxy server can reveal who's visiting malicious sites, and network logs in general can give us the collective insight that may be useful in stopping distributed attacks like distributed denial of service. Now, our web servers log many types of information about our web requests, so evidence of potential threats and attacks will be visible here, almost certainly. You'll see information collected about each web session, including IP address, the date and time, the method that was used, like was it an HTTP GET or POST, the browser that was used, and the status code. So, for example, 400 series HTTP response codes are client-side errors, and 500 series response codes are server-side errors. And for better insight into what these logs can tell us, we want to feed these to a SIEM or intrusion detection or prevention solution for correlation and analysis. Now, here are some log files that exist on client and server systems. So sending these to a SIEM, a Security Information Event Management System, can establish a central audit trail and give us visibility into the scope of an attack. We have the system log that contains information about hardware changes, device updates, time synchronization, and group policy application, to name a few. We have the application log that contains information about software applications, when they're launched, was execution successful or did it fail, warnings about potential problems or errors. The security event log will contain information about a successful login, as well as unauthorized attempts to access the system and its resources. We can use this log to identify attackers trying to log into our computer systems, and if we send these to a SIEM solution where we have centralized correlation, we can spot potential attacks like a password spray attack or attempts to move laterally through our environment. This log captures information on file access. It can determine who's downloaded certain data. It's going to give us access events where security is involved. And you'll find log files with these names in the event viewer on any Windows client or server. So DNS logs contain virtually all DNS server level activity, including zone transfer, DNS server errors, DNS caching, and even DNSSEC related events. Now, do bear in mind DNS query logging is often disabled by default due to the extremely high volume in most environments. You can certainly enable that logging Just know that you're potentially going to be dealing with a lot of data, and think about the impact that has on your disk space and on your monitoring systems. Authentication logs, just information about login events, logging success or failure. You'll see these in your identity management platforms, your identity providers. You'll find multiple sources, though, of authenticating log files and the typical domain environment. That might be Radius, Active Directory, and then cloud identity providers like Azure Active Directory. Dump files. These are generated when a computer crashes. You get that blue screen of death on Windows, and the dump file has contents of memory that's saved out to that file with the DMP extension. And you can analyze those with tools like Blue Screen Review and Windows Debugger and a kernel debugger. Logs from your voice application can be valuable in identifying anomalous activity with your voice communications, including unauthorized phone calls and even potential attacks, actually. So your VoIP and call manager logs will provide information about the calls being made and the devices they originate from, and they might capture call quality by logging metrics like mean optical score, jitter, and loss of signal, because a significant loss in quality may indicate an attack, a disruptive attack like a denial of service. Each call is typically logged both inbound and outbound, with the person making the call and the person receiving the call, which can potentially help us identify unauthorized long-distance calling, which is something an attacker may actually be in search of. That toll calling has value. The SIP protocol is used for internet-based calls, and the log files generally show 100 events, which is the invite and the initiation of a connection that relates to ringing, and the 200 or OK is followed by an acknowledgement. You might think of that call connection sequence as the voice call equivalent of a TCP/IP handshake, and if we see large numbers of calls failing to connect in our logs, it may indicate a disruptive attack like a denial of service attack. And remember, your hardware VoIP phones are embedded systems that have to be secured. It's a piece of hardware plugged into the network, so it will be a target. So let's talk about the 3 flavors of syslog that are mentioned in the exam objectives, and the 3 that you're likely to see in the field as you work with Linux. So syslog is a log collector, as it collects event logs from various devices, often network devices, and those events are often rolled up to a central syslog server. In the Linux version, it's implemented as syslog-d or syslog daemon, which stores the log files in the var log syslog directory by default. We have rsyslog, which is called rocket fast as it has high performance, and it receives data, transforms, and can send output to destinations like a SIM server or other syslog. I actually use it for log forwarding up to a central syslog server quite frequently. And then there's syslog-ng, which is an open source logging solution for Unix and Linux. It has broader platform support than rsyslog. So syslog-d is the original. That's what's baked into Linux out of the box. These other 2, rsyslog and syslog-ng, are great open source options that came later, and each serve their purpose. Next up, we have journal control and nxlog, so other logging solutions. Journal control is a utility for querying and displaying logs from journal-d, which is systemd's logging service. So systemd, the system daemon, provides several system components for Linux. And journal-d collects and stores log data in binary format, and journal control is used to query and display these logs in a readable format. nxlog is an open source log management tool that helps identify security risks in a Linux or Unix environment. It's multi-platform log collection and centralization that offers processing features like log enrichment and log forwarding. It's similar to syslog-ng or rsyslog, but it's not limited to Unix and syslog only. It actually supports Linux, Windows, and Android. So bandwidth monitors are used to help understand your network traffic flow. So we can use these to monitor for changes in traffic patterns, identify devices on the network that are causing bottlenecks. And these can detect broadcast storms and potential denial of service attacks. It's really a way for IT pros to determine actual bandwidth availability for your systems. So metadata. Metadata is data that provides information about other data. So we have email metadata, so that would include the email headers that contain detailed information about source, destination, and route through the email providers from sender to recipient. This can be used when phishing emails are received to identify the bad actor that sent the message. In the mobile world, telecom providers retain information about phone calls, including calls made, received, text messages, internet usage, and location information. This can be used in an investigation to provide evidence of a suspect's location, amongst other things. Then in the web context, website metadata provides information about every page created on a website, including author, date created, images, and other files, videos, PDFs, etc. When investigations are being carried out, the file metadata can be used to track information like the author of the file, the date created, the date modified, even the file size. It's worth noting the metadata does not include information on actions like printing or copying. And when someone takes a photograph, the metadata might include geotagging that documents the location in which the photograph was taken. And we discussed earlier that geotagging is typically enabled by default, so it's something to bear in mind from a security perspective. It may be a feature that you'd like to turn off in some cases. It's also worth mentioning that you can't get metadata from a deleted file after recovery, generally speaking. So if a file's deleted and then you recover it, some of that metadata is going to be lost through that path that the file has taken into the netherworld and then back again. NetFlow, SFlow, and IPFix. So these are network monitoring solutions. So let's start with NetFlow, which is a Cisco product that monitors network device traffic. It can identify the load on the network, and in an investigation, it can help identify patterns in network traffic. It's proprietary. It's a Cisco product. It's not open source. SFlow is a multi-vendor product that provides visibility into network traffic patterns, and it can help identify malicious traffic to help in securing the network. So its core mission is a little bit different than NetFlow. It's really more monitoring focused with good data collection to support better reporting. It supports a wide variety of network hardware vendors. And then we have IPFlow information export, which can be used to capture traffic from the node itself. And the data can be exported to a collector within the node and then used to identify data traveling through a switch to facilitate billing. And it can format IPFlow data and then forward that off to a collector. But it's open source and it's similar to and patterned after NetFlow. I want to revisit a topic we touched on briefly a bit earlier, and that's the output of protocol analyzers. I'd like to talk a bit more about the format, compatibility, and the use in forensic investigation. So we mentioned a protocol analyzer can also be referred to as a packet sniffer, and they can save data that they collect as a packet capture file, a .pcap format. That PCAP format is a binary format with support for nanosecond precision timestamps, and Wireshark, TCP Relay, and TCP Dump all support that format, and it can be used for forensics by replaying network traffic sent to network devices from which these protocol analyzers capture traffic, and law enforcement has used PCAP data to successfully prosecute cybercrimes. Think of it this way, just as closed-circuit TV can capture a video sequence of events, we can reconstruct a sequence of events on the network using the data in these packet capture files. And in 4.4, given an incident, apply mitigation techniques or controls to secure an environment. So we'll touch on endpoint security, mobile device management, firewalls, PKI, segmentation, and response automation, just to name a few. But let's start with reconfiguration of our endpoint security solutions. So maybe our use of technology has evolved. Maybe we have new applications, a new operating system that's come out, or maybe we've just suffered a data breach. And so we might have to reconfigure our endpoint security solutions to meet the changing conditions. So for example, that might mean updating our approved applications list. If we have an application that's not listed, it can't be launched. So maybe we have some applications we need to add, maybe others we need to remove. And our application blocker deny list works in reverse. If we list an application as dangerous, perhaps we add certain offensive security tools on there. And if it's on the block list, it can't run. And to be clear, I mean offensive security in the context of offense and defense. So quarantine helps us in a couple of scenarios. So when a device has been infected with a virus, we can remove it from the network and quarantine that device. And with network access control, we authenticate a user and the device is checked and confirmed patched and compliant before being granted access to the network. And if we've updated our baseline for compliance in our endpoint management solution, our network access control can enforce our will there and ensure that if that device is not compliant, it's going to be blocked and placed in a quarantine network for remediation, potentially bringing it up to our new standard of baseline compliance. So let's talk configuration changes. So as new attacks emerge, configuration changes may be necessary to secure the environment. This is certainly true in the context of our firewalls, which can be used to block traffic, and we can use an MDM solution or group policy to change the configuration of the firewall on endpoint devices. I'm talking about a host-based firewall in that case. So that process will vary for network and host-based firewalls, of course. And then there's mobile device management, which can be used to push configuration changes to mobile devices. It can enforce device settings from password policy to blocking the camera. As new operating systems are released for iOS and Android, we can update our minimum acceptable operating system version. And in the world of data loss prevention, that's policy-based protection of sensitive data. It's usually based on labels or pattern match. So as we have changes in our environment, maybe new types of data or new ways to identify sensitive data, we may need to update our labeling policies here. And this protects data at rest or in transit in email, internet, cloud drives, etc. But if we have new patterns emerge for identifying sensitive data, we may need to update our policies from time to time. Content filters or URL filters, so changes in attacks might require an update to the content filters in a proxy server, or a unified threat management firewall, which is a multifunction device that often includes URL and content filtering functionality. Now, some devices, like a next-generation firewall, may automatically detect new threats and adjust accordingly. Now, one of the characteristics of a next-gen firewall is it can consume intelligence from outside the firewall frequently. This may be threat intelligence feeds or other features, so the need to update that device manually may be less frequent. Now, sometimes endpoints reporting a host or a trust error may indicate a certificate problem, so we might need to update a certificate that has expired or revoke a certificate because it's been compromised. Internet-facing services need a certificate issued by a commercial CA. That's because your in-house certificate authority will not be trusted by users on the internet or their systems or the businesses they work for. You really need certificates from commercial providers like DigiCert and GoDaddy for your public-facing services. So isolation means blocking access altogether, and air-gap endpoints are used for that reason, to view classified data and isolate the endpoint from the network to protect against a network-based attack. The air gap eliminates all network connectivity, wired, Wi-Fi, you name it. The only way to add or extract data from an air-gapped computer is by using a removable device such as a USB drive. And in these situations, requiring users entering an area for confidential meetings or to view secret research to place their phones in a Faraday cage is a great idea, as it blocks electromagnetic signals from entering or exiting the cage, rendering cellular signals useless. But just another layer of isolation. So containment is about minimizing damage and limiting the scope of an incident. Examples of containment would include, for example, if an endpoint has been compromised and may be infected by a virus, IT security will contain to stop the malware from spreading. Removing infected machines from the network is one way we do that. Disabling user accounts that have been used to breach your network is another. Do remember the incident response process. Containing the incident comes before finding the root cause and full remediation. A containment process that minimizes downtime and disruption is preferable. We can consider segmentation from a few different angles. So let's start with mobile device management. In a bring your own device mobile device scenario, mobile app management will keep personal and business data separate. Mobile app management actually puts a boundary around our business data so we can apply controls to the business data without impacting the personal data or the device itself. And this also prevents personal data from being removed in a remote wipe. The remote wipe is selective and it only applies to the business data. For endpoints, we can segment devices that have become vulnerable, such as an unpatched printer where there are no updates. You could place these printers in a VLAN and restrict traffic in and out. Non-compliant devices in a network can be quarantined until remediated. This is possible in the network access control functionality we talked about just a few moments ago. For applications within a private subnet, VLANs can be used to carry out segmentation and traffic filtering for sensitive apps and data. And these rules could be enforced with subnets and firewalls, for example. So SIM and SOAR, so Security Information Event Management, which we've touched on multiple times, and then Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response. So SIM is the solution that centrally collects data from many other sources on the network and provides real-time monitoring, analysis, and notification of the potential attacks. SOAR is the companion functionality that provides centralized alert and response automation with threat-specific playbooks. And response may be fully automated or single-click, running on demand generally. And whether that response is fully automated or single-click really depends on our confidence in that scenario being the same and the response being appropriate 100% of the time, or being able to filter based on specific criteria to ensure that the response automation only triggers when appropriate and with the appropriate focus. But these capabilities are commonly delivered together in a single solution. And they're often using AI, machine learning, threat intelligence, but it's the analysis functionality of the SIM that enables us to then act on that in an automated way with SOAR. And while we're on the topic of SOAR in the context of threat mitigation, I want to talk about playbooks and runbooks and the difference between the two. I've seen this covered less than clearly in a couple of different places. So let's begin with runbooks, which document info on events and the necessary actions to stop threats. These can be used to configure automated response in a playbook. So the runbook documents the human analyst response steps. And then the playbook contains a set of rules and actions to identify incidents and take preventative action. This may need to be amended for better automated response as threats evolve. I quite often see this SOAR playbook function taking inputs from the SIM function that will trigger in the right circumstances. This is the response automation. So the playbook is the response automation, the runbook is the documentation of the human analyst steps. So 4.5 asks us to explain the key aspects of digital forensics. We're going to touch on some really interesting material here. Documentation and evidence, acquiring evidence, how considerations in forensic investigations differ between the cloud and on-premises, and then a variety of digital forensics topics from maintaining integrity to the e-discovery process to preserving evidence. This is really some interesting subject matter that all relates to investigating cyber crime. So I really find this interesting. So let's start with the concept of a legal hold. So this is protecting any documents that can be used in evidence from being altered or destroyed. It's sometimes called litigation hold. Then we have chain of custody, which tracks the movement of evidence through its collection, safeguarding, and analysis lifecycle. It documents each person who handled the evidence, the date and time it was collected or transferred, and the purpose for the transfer. It confirms appropriate collection, storage, and handling throughout the process as it moves toward use in legal trial. Admissibility of evidence refers to the requirements for evidence to be admissible or allowed in a court of law. So to be admissible, evidence must be relevant to a fact at issue in the case. In other words, the evidence makes a fact either more probable or less probable than it would be without that evidence. The fact must be material to the case, which means it's important in proving a case. So an eyewitness is a material witness that is important to proving that an action actually took place, that an event took place. The evidence must be competent or legally collected. So competent in this case means reliable, and it must be obtained by legal means. So to prevail in court, evidence must be sufficient also, which means convincing without question, leaving no doubt, or you'll sometimes hear it phrased beyond a reasonable doubt. So video evidence, such as that we might get from the closed-circuit TV system that's part of our company's video surveillance system, can be a good source of evidence for helping to identify attackers and the time the attack was launched. It can be very important in apprehending suspects and reconstructing the timelines of events. Now, timelines of the sequence of events takes a different form when we think about files on a disk, for example. So timestamps matter in that case. Each file has timestamps showing when files were created, last modified, and last accessed. And the time offset can be important where evidence is collected across multiple time zones. We have to record the offset based on time zone. So for example, recording the offset, it looks as if it started in Chicago, but if we apply time normalization, when it's 4 a.m. in London, the time is 10 p.m. in Chicago, and we need to take that into account. E-discovery tags are virtual sticky notes or labels attached to documents, making them easier to search or find. They can really help the legal team stay organized in building a defensible case. Reports play a role in documenting our incident response process. So all key discussions and decisions made during the eradication phase of an incident response should be well documented. A report should be produced from the post-incident review and presented to all of your relevant stakeholders. Event logs can provide a means to reconstruct a sequence of events, and centralized log collection is going to be helpful here. An audit trail is really a requirement. Maintaining audit trail is actually a legal requirement in many cases. To track incidents, we need to be actively monitoring and actively logging changes to patterns in our log files or traffic patterns in our network. And that's where a SIM can help with log collection, aggregation, and analysis to really tell us what's of interest, what's changed in that trail within our logs. Now, when the police are involved, the police may conduct interviews. They may take witness statements and try to develop a picture of who was involved, and maybe then use photo fits while the image of a suspect is still fresh in the memory of any witnesses, so they have a better chance of apprehending that suspect. So a photo fit is a reconstructed picture of a suspect, generally created with the help of specialized computer software, and a witness providing a description. So this is a bit of extra credit here. I don't believe types of evidence are going to show up on the exam. These weren't called out specifically on the exam objectives. I wanted to lay these out here because you might find them an interesting completion of your tour of evidence and forensic investigation. So best evidence is evidence that is original and it's preferred by courts. Secondary evidence is a copy of an original. Direct evidence proves or disproves an act based on the 5 human senses, any one of the 5 human senses. Conclusive evidence is incontrovertible. It can't be denied. It overrides all other types. Circumstantial evidence can be inferred from other information. For example, John visited our house at 1 p.m. while we were gone. When we returned at 2 p.m., the living room had been destroyed. We can infer from that evidence that perhaps John destroyed the living room while we were gone. Corroborative evidence is supporting evidence, but it cannot stand on its own. It has to be supported by other evidence to make the conclusion more certain. Opinions: we can have witnesses in court provide expert and non-expert opinions. Of course, an expert opinion is generally going to carry more weight when one is available. Hearsay is evidence not based on first-hand knowledge. In other words, not based on a witness's personal knowledge, but on something they heard from another source. But in the end, to prevail in court, the collective evidence must be relevant, complete, sufficient, and reliable. So let's move on to the acquisition or acquiring of evidence. So when you discover an incident, it's important that you begin to collect evidence and as much information about the incident as possible as quickly as you can. Evidence can be used in a subsequent legal action or in finding an attacker's identity, and evidence can also assist you in determining the extent of damage. How evidence is stored can also play a factor in admissibility, so we need to understand the concerns for evidence storage. So how to retain logs, drive images, VM snapshots, and other data sets for recovery for internal and forensic investigations. So protections for evidence storage include locked cabinets or safes, dedicated or isolated storage facilities, offline storage, access restrictions, and activity tracking, so tracking who comes in and out of an area where evidence is stored, as well as hash management and encryption for digital evidence. A few areas of concern and consideration and acquisition of evidence that are called out in the exam objectives include the disk, the hard drive. So one concern there maybe was the storage media itself damaged. Random access memory is volatile memory used to run applications. The contents of RAM are often going to disappear on system reboot. The swapper page file, which is used for running applications when RAM is exhausted, is also going to be a fairly volatile storage medium. The operating system itself, was there corruption of data associated with the OS or applications? Will definitely be a question that's top of mind. When it comes to devices, when the police are taking evidence from laptops, desktops, and mobile devices, they typically take a complete system image, a forensic image it's called. The original image is kept intact, installed on another computer, potentially hashed, and then analyzed to find evidence of any criminal activity. Firmware, embedded code, could be reverse engineered by an attacker, so original source code must be compared to the code in use on that firmware to ensure that it is not compromised. A coding expert to compare both lots of source code in a technique called regression testing will be necessary at that point. And rootkits and backdoors are going to be concerns when it comes to firmware. A snapshot. If the evidence is from a virtual machine, a snapshot of the virtual machine can be exported for investigation. A cache is a special high-speed storage that can either be a reserved section of main memory or an independent high-speed storage device. You'll see cache off the CPU, for example. Memory cache and disk cache are both volatile. The network. So the OS includes command line tools like netstat, which we talked about earlier in this domain, that provide information that could disappear if you reboot the computer. So like RAM, those network connections, the listening ports, etc. are volatile and they're going to be lost on reboot, so they need to be captured before that system is powered down. Artifacts can refer to any piece of evidence, including log files, registry hives, DNA, fingerprints, or fibers of clothing normally invisible to the naked eye. So order of volatility. So to determine what happened on a system, you need a copy of the data. And an all-important question is, what evidence should you collect first? Well, the answer is the most volatile or perishable information should be collected first. If it disappears with a system reboot or passage of time, it is volatile. So in approximate order, we have CPU, cache, and register contents, routing tables, ARP cache, process tables, kernel statistics, live network connections and data flows, memory, so RAM, temporary file system and swap or page file, data on hard disk, remotely logged data, and data stored on archival, media, and backup. So number 1 is most volatile, number 8 would be least volatile in this case. And collection must also consider questions of storage, which we talked about a moment ago, and chain of custody. So considerations on premises and in the cloud. So customer rights and capabilities to perform forensic investigation varies in the cloud versus on premises. In the physical world, between business partners in a supply chain, right to audit clauses allow an auditor to visit the premises to inspect and ensure that the contractor is complying with contractual obligations. This could help an auditor identify inferior goods, short shipments, kickbacks, gifts and gratuities, commissions to brokers and others, or services allegedly performed that were not actually necessary. This becomes a little more difficult in the cloud because you can't physically visit a cloud data center or that cloud service provider. We're really worried more about data sovereignty and data handling when we're thinking about the cloud. So cloud data should be stored and have data sovereignty in the region where it's stored. So data sovereignty means that that cloud data is subject to the laws and regulations of the region or the country where it's stored. Many countries have laws requiring businesses to store data within their borders. Germany is a perfect example, which helps protect the privacy and the rights of their citizens. Now, the U.S. introduced the Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data, or CLOUD Act, in 2018 due to problems that the FBI faced in forcing Microsoft to hand over data stored in Ireland. So that law aids in evidence collection and investigation of serious crimes. And in 2019, the UK and the US signed a data sharing agreement to give law enforcement agencies in each country faster access to evidence held by cloud service providers. These laws are great first steps, but I've only mentioned 3 countries here after all, so they are somewhat limited in their scope. At a more fundamental level, as a customer, you should verify your right to audit and audit procedures with your cloud provider to ensure you understand your rights and their legal obligations before you sign contracts. If it's not written into the contract, it means very little. And forensic investigators should know their legal rights in every jurisdiction where the organization hosts data in the cloud, because some countries will not allow e-discovery from outside their borders. It's important to know. In a traditional forensic procedure, it's easy to maintain an accurate history of time, location, and data handling. In the cloud, physical location is somewhat obscure. Now, investigators can acquire a VM image from any workstation connected to the internet. Timestamps and offsets can be more challenging due to location. Really, maintaining a proper chain of custody is more challenging in the cloud. We have to pay attention to the details. Breach notification laws should be adhered to, and these vary by country and regulation. For example, GDPR requires notification within 72 hours. And GDPR applies to any company with customers in the EU. It doesn't matter where the company is located, so a US company with customers in the EU would still have to adhere to GDPR regulations or risk fine. Now let's talk proving data integrity. So when either the forensic copy or the system image is being analyzed, the data and applications are hashed at collection. That hash can be used as a checksum to ensure integrity later. The file can be hashed before and after collection to ensure a match on the original hash value to prove data integrity, that it's not been altered. Now, data provenance effectively provides a historical record of the data and its origins and the forensic activities performed on it. It's similar to data lineage, but it also includes the inputs, entities, systems, and processes that influence the data. Preservation is also mentioned in the exam objectives. So data needs to be preserved in its original state so that it can be produced as evidence in court. And the original data must remain unaltered and pristine. So what is a forensic copy of evidence? Well, it's an image or exact sector-by-sector copy of a hard disk or other storage device taken using specialized software, preserving an exact copy of the original disk. So in other words, deleted files, slack space, system files, executables, all of that will be part of a forensic image. We're leaving nothing out. Putting a copy of the most vital evidence in a worm drive will prevent any tampering with the evidence. You can't actually delete data from a worm drive. WORM is an acronym for Write Once, Read Many. You can also write, protect, or put a legal hold on some types of cloud storage. It usually involves just flipping a bit if that setting is available in the cloud portal. So now we'll talk e-discovery or electronic discovery, which is the process of identifying, preserving, collecting, processing, reviewing, and producing electronically stored information in litigation. That is a mouthful. Not to be confused with the complementary but distinctly different process of digital forensics, which involves identifying, preserving, collecting, recovering, analyzing, and reporting on digital information. Recovering and analyzing jump out at first glance, but we'll unpack the difference between these two in just a moment. And during e-discovery, cloud service providers may be subpoenaed to allow collection, review, and interpretation of electronic documents and data. This process is made easier if you handle some of these details in the negotiation before you sign your contract. So digital forensics versus e-discovery. What's the difference? Well, forensics involves the use of a forensic expert to protect data integrity and to copy, capture, or recover the data stored on a device. E-discovery firms typically do not analyze the data they collect, and forensic investigators have specialized training enabling them to analyze data, protect data integrity, and recover missing or deleted data. So to put it simply, e-discovery is about gathering the data. It's electronic search and collection. The digital forensics process is much more involved and technical in nature, but complements e-discovery. Digital forensics can recover and uncover data to make it available for the gathering in e-discovery. So data recovery. So forensic data recovery is a process used to retrieve data that will be used for legal purposes. It's important that investigators work with information in a way that will not change or compromise the original source, and they can use a variety of techniques to fill in missing pieces or make information meaningful. For example, restoring a damaged or deleted partition, looking for traces of information which could reveal how and when the partition was used. And it may be working with computers which have been seeded with safety measures to prevent legal investigations, so it requires special procedures. But ultimately, e-discovery works in conjunction with digital forensics. Their functions are complementary. Forensic data recovery, as you can see, really requires specialized training and knowledge. So let's talk non-repudiation, which is the guarantee that no one can deny a transaction. There are a couple of common methods to provide non-repudiation. One is digital signatures, which prove that a digital message or document was not modified, intentionally or unintentionally, from the time it was signed. It's based on asymmetric cryptography, a public-private key pair. It's the digital equivalent of a handwritten signature or a stamped seal. And then there's message authentication code, where the two parties that are communicating can verify non-repudiation. It's generated via a cryptographic algorithm that depends on both the message and session key known only to the sender and receiver. Digital signatures are very common today, and they're covered in more detail in Domain 2, if you'd like to go back and take a look. Historically, Strategic intelligence refers to when governments gather and potentially exchange data about cybercriminals so they can work together to reduce threats. In the context of forensic investigation, gathering evidence can also be performed using strategic intelligence methods. It focuses on gathering threat information about a domain, including business info, geographic info, or other details on a specific country, for example. Now, counterintelligence refers to the target of someone's strategic intelligence who may want to prevent that intelligence gathering from occurring, in which case the target may perform strategic counterintelligence to identify and disrupt the adversary gathering intelligence on them. This is true of threat actors at a nation-state level every day, and those techniques, those concepts can be applied in the commercial space. And congratulations, you've reached the end of Domain 4 of the Comptia Security Plus Exam Cram series. I hope you're getting value out of the series. If you have questions, leave them in the comments section below the video or reach out directly on LinkedIn. And I will see you soon for Domain 5. Until next time, take care and stay safe.